Picture this. You're sitting in class working on an assignment when suddenly the loudspeaker crackles to life. Lockdown. This is not a drill. Your teacher's face goes pale. The lights go off. And in that moment, everything you thought you knew about safety at school vanishes. But here's what nobody talks about. The real danger often isn't what's happening outside your classroom door. It's what's happening inside your mind. And today, I'm going to share with you the psychological truths about school lockdowns that could literally save your life, based on real experiences from students and teachers who have lived through these terrifying moments. What you're about to hear isn't just a collection of scary stories. This is a deep dive into the hidden psychology of threat response, the critical mistakes people make during lockdowns, and the survival strategies that actually work when your school becomes a crime scene. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some people freeze when they should run, why kindness can become a weapon, and why the quiet kid in your class might be sending signals that everyone's ignoring. Section 1. The invisible warning signs. Let's start with something that makes everyone uncomfortable: the warning signs. We live in a society that's obsessed with identifying threats after they've already materialized. But what about before? What about the signs that show up weeks, months, or even years before a lockdown situation becomes real? This is where the psychology gets fascinating and deeply unsettling. Think about the first story I'm going to analyze with you. There was a student, let's call him Luke, who literally never spoke in class. Not because he was shy in the traditional sense, but because something deeper was happening. He was becoming invisible. And here's the critical insight that most people miss. When someone becomes invisible in a social environment like a school, they're not just withdrawing. They're often conducting an internal calculation about their place in that environment, and whether that environment deserves their presence or their wrath. The psychology of social isolation in adolescence is profound. Research shows that when teenagers experience sustained social rejection, their brains actually start processing social pain in the same regions that process physical pain. This isn't metaphorical. The hurt is literally registered as physical suffering. And when that pain becomes chronic, when day after day a student walks through hallways where nobody sees them, where their existence is either mocked or ignored, something dangerous can begin to form: a narrative of revenge. But here's where it gets complicated. The narrative of revenge doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like quiet resignation. Sometimes it manifests as withdrawal. And this is precisely why so many warning signs get missed. We're trained to look for the angry outburst, the threatening statement, the violent drawing in a notebook. But we're not trained to recognize the student who's slowly disappearing before our eyes. In Luke's case, there were multiple warning signs that went unaddressed. First, there was the visible bullying happening in the computer class. Seniors were throwing paper at him, mocking his silence, treating him like a target for their entertainment. And the teacher did nothing. This is a critical failure point. When authority figures witness bullying and fail to intervene, they're not just being passive. They're actively teaching two lessons simultaneously. They're teaching the bullies that their behavior is acceptable, and they're teaching the victim that no one will protect them. Second, Luke was dealing with harassment in multiple classes, not just one. This suggests a pattern of sustained victimization across different social contexts. When a student is being targeted in multiple environments, the psychological impact compounds exponentially. It's not just about one bad class or one group of mean kids. It becomes about the entire school system feeling unsafe. Third, and this is subtle but important, Luke accepted a ride home from someone he barely knew. On the surface, this seems like normal teenage social behavior. But when you consider that Luke rarely interacted with anyone, this suggests a level of desperation for human connection. He was so starved for basic kindness that a simple offer of a car ride became significant enough to remember where that person lived, to track down their house later, to use that one moment of kindness as a reason to confess his plans. This brings us to one of the most uncomfortable truths about school violence. Often, the perpetrators aren't monsters. They're deeply wounded people who have been systematically failed by every social system that was supposed to protect them. And I want to be absolutely clear here. Understanding this psychology doesn't excuse violent behavior. It doesn't justify bringing weapons to school or threatening others. But if we want to prevent these situations, we have to be willing to look at the uncomfortable reality of how they develop. The transformation from victim to potential perpetrator follows a fairly predictable psychological path. First comes the sustained victimization. Then comes the period of seeking help or connection, which is usually ignored or dismissed. Then comes the internal shift where the person stops seeing themselves as part of the community and starts seeing themselves as separate from it, sometimes even opposed to it. And finally comes the planning phase, where revenge fantasies start turning into actual logistics. What's terrifying about this progression is how invisible it can be. Luke never made overt threats. He never had violent outbursts. He simply became quieter and quieter until one day he showed up at school with a duffel bag and a mask, trying to get inside. And the only reason he didn't succeed wasn't because anyone intervened in his psychological spiral. It was because the school had good physical security. The doors were locked. But here's the question we should be asking. How many Lukes are sitting in classrooms right now? How many students are in that dangerous space between victimization and potential violence? And what are we doing about it? Section 2. The terror of uncertainty. Now let's talk about what happens during an actual lockdown, and specifically, let's discuss the psychological state that's most dangerous during these situations. It's not fear, it's uncertainty. Fear, believe it or not, can be useful. Fear triggers your fight or flight response. Fear gives you adrenaline. Fear can save your life if you know what to do with it. But uncertainty is paralyzing. Consider the classroom where the teacher heard footsteps in the hallway during a lockdown. Slow footsteps, just one person walking, and then those footsteps stopped right outside their door. In that moment, every person in that room was experiencing what psychologists call acute uncertainty stress. They didn't know who was on the other side of that door. They didn't know what that person wanted. They didn't know if they were safe or in immediate danger. And that uncertainty creates a specific type of psychological paralysis. The human brain is remarkably bad at dealing with ambiguous threats. We've evolved to respond to clear dangers. See a predator, run. See a cliff, don't walk off it. But ambiguous threats, situations where we don't know if we're in danger or not, situations where the wrong response could make things worse, these create a cognitive overload. Your brain is trying to process multiple scenarios simultaneously, calculate multiple outcomes, prepare for multiple responses. And often, the result is that you do nothing. This is why the knock at the door was so psychologically devastating. 3 soft knocks, not aggressive, just knock, knock, knock. And then the doorknob turning, not being forced, just being tried. Turned one way, then the other, as if someone was casually checking if it was locked. And then the voice. This is just a drill. You can open the door now. That voice introduced a new layer of uncertainty. Is this actually a drill? Is it a teacher checking on us? Or is it someone pretending to be authority in order to gain access? The teacher in that situation made the right call. She shook her head no. She kept the door locked. But think about the psychological calculation she had to make in that split second. If she was wrong, if it really was a drill or a teacher, she would look foolish. But if she was right, if that was actually a threat on the other side of that door, opening it could have resulted in violence or death. So she chose the option that prioritized physical safety over social comfort. And that's a critical lesson. During uncertain threat situations, always prioritize physical safety over social comfort. It doesn't matter if you might embarrass yourself. It doesn't matter if someone might think you're overreacting. If something feels wrong, treat it as wrong until you have clear evidence otherwise. This is especially important in school settings, where students are conditioned to obey authority figures. That conditioning can become dangerous during a lockdown because it creates a vulnerability. Someone mimicking authority can potentially manipulate students into unsafe behaviors. The voice saying, "This is just a drill," was likely an attempt at social engineering. Social engineering is when someone manipulates people into performing actions or divulging information by exploiting their trust in authority or social norms. In a school context, students are trained to listen to teachers and administrators. So when someone says, "This is just a drill, open the door," there's an automatic psychological impulse to comply, especially among younger students. But here's what you need to understand. During an actual lockdown, legitimate authority figures will not ask you to open doors. They have keys. They have the ability to unlock doors from the outside. They have protocols. If someone is asking you to unlock a door during a lockdown, that is a massive red flag. That person either doesn't have the authority to be there, or they don't have legitimate access, or they're attempting to create a vulnerability. And then there was the scream. One scream from down the hall, a girl's voice, and then silence. This is where the psychological experience of a lockdown becomes truly traumatic, because in that moment, everyone in that classroom knew something bad had happened. They didn't know what, they didn't know how bad, but they knew. And they also knew they could do nothing about it. They had to sit in silence, in darkness, listening, waiting, hoping that whatever happened down the hall wouldn't happen to them. This creates what's called survivor's guilt in real time. It's the psychological phenomenon where you feel guilty for being safe when others might not be. Even though you had no control over the situation, even though there was nothing you could do, your brain starts creating narratives of responsibility. Should I have done something? Could I have helped? And these thoughts can become intrusive and persistent, leading to long-term psychological impacts. The trauma of school lockdowns isn't just about the immediate fear. It's about the long-term rewiring of your sense of safety. After experiencing a real lockdown, especially one with actual violence, your brain recalibrates what school means. It's no longer just a place of learning. It's also a place where bad things can happen, where you might have to hide in a closet for 2 hours in complete darkness, where you might hear screams and not know if your friends are safe. And that recalibration changes how you experience education for months, or even years afterward. Section 3. The failure of systems. Let's shift now to talk about something that makes administrators very uncomfortable: the systematic failures that allow dangerous situations to develop in schools. Because the truth is, most school violence isn't a surprise. Most incidents have warning signs, red flags, moments where intervention could have changed the outcome. But those interventions don't happen, and we need to understand why. Take the story about the stepdaughter and the escaped prisoner. Here's a situation where a convicted murderer, someone serving multiple consecutive life sentences, was being transported on a prison bus when a vehicle crashed into that bus, killing 10 prisoners and allowing 20 to escape. This is already a catastrophic failure of the correctional system. But then that escaped prisoner, who happened to be the biological father of a student, showed up at a school trying to collect his daughter. And this is where the school system's failures become apparent. First failure point. The person at the front desk or security checkpoint didn't immediately recognize that the situation was wrong. Someone claiming to be a biological father, showing up without prior arrangement. For a child who has no records indicating this person has custody or visitation rights, should have triggered immediate red flags. But it didn't, at least not right away. The system relied on a teacher receiving a notification and having to manually intervene and say, "No, this is wrong. Don't release my child." Second failure point. There was nearly a 10-minute window between the initial concern and the lockdown being initiated. 10 minutes where a dangerous individual was potentially on or near school property. 10 minutes where students were vulnerable. This suggests that the school's threat assessment and response protocols were not sufficiently rapid or decisive. Third failure point, and this is systemic rather than specific to one school. How did an escaped prisoner know which school to target? How did he know his biological daughter was there? This suggests either that his information wasn't sufficiently outdated, or that he had been able to track her location despite being incarcerated. This is a failure of information security and family court systems to adequately protect children from dangerous individuals. But let's expand this to a broader analysis of how schools systematically fail to prevent violence. The most common failure is the normalization of warning signs. When a student is being bullied, when a student is isolated, when a student makes concerning statements, these are often dismissed as normal teenage behavior, or just a phase, or kids being kids. This normalization is dangerous because it trains both staff and students to ignore signals that should trigger intervention. Another systematic failure is the over-reliance on physical security measures without corresponding investment in psychological and social support. Many schools have invested heavily in door locks, camera systems, security personnel, and lockdown drills. These are important, and as we saw in several of these stories, good physical security can prevent violence. But physical security alone doesn't address the root causes of school violence. It doesn't help the isolated student. It doesn't stop the bullying. It doesn't provide mental health support. It just tries to contain the damage after someone has already reached the point of attempting violence. There's also a critical failure in how schools handle threat assessment. Most schools have some form of threat assessment protocol, but these protocols are often reactive rather than proactive. They kick in after someone has made an overt threat or after an incident has occurred. But the most effective threat assessment is ongoing, observational, and focused on identifying concerning patterns of behavior before they escalate to violence. This means training teachers to recognize not just the angry outburst, but the slow withdrawal, not just the explicit threat, but the implicit warning signs like giving away possessions, saying goodbye to people in ways that seem final, or expressing hopelessness about the future. It means creating systems where students can report concerns about peers without fear of retaliation or social consequences. And it means actually following up on those reports with appropriate interventions, not just disciplinary actions. Perhaps the most significant systematic failure is the lack of genuine mental health support in schools. Many schools have one counselor for hundreds of students. That counselor is often overwhelmed with administrative tasks, college applications, and scheduling issues, leaving little time for meaningful mental health intervention. Students who need help often can't get it, not because they don't ask, but because the resources simply don't exist. And even when resources do exist, there's often a stigma attached to using them. Students don't want to be seen as the kid who sees the counselor. They don't want their peers to know they're struggling. This stigma is particularly strong among teenage boys, who are socialized to suppress emotional vulnerability and handle problems independently. So the students who most need help are often the least likely to seek it out. Section 4. The psychology of the perpetrator. Now we're going to discuss something that many people find uncomfortable, but it's absolutely essential if we want to prevent school violence. We need to understand the psychology of people who commit these acts, not to excuse them, not to justify their actions, but to understand how someone reaches the point where bringing weapons to school seems like a reasonable response to their problems. Let's return to Luke's story, because it's actually a perfect case study in how this psychology develops. Luke was a quiet kid who never spoke. He wasn't weird-looking. He wasn't overtly aggressive. He was just quiet. And for a long time, that quietness was probably a coping mechanism. When you're being bullied or socially rejected, sometimes the safest thing to do is make yourself small, invisible, unnoticed. Don't give them more ammunition. Don't draw more attention. But here's what happens psychologically when you adopt that strategy. You start to disappear, not just to others, but to yourself. Your sense of identity becomes wrapped up in being invisible. And as that invisibility deepens, so does the resentment. Because you're not choosing to be invisible because you want to be. You're doing it because it's the only way to survive in an environment that feels hostile. And then comes the isolation feedback loop. Because you're quiet and withdrawn, people don't reach out to you. And because people don't reach out to you, you become more quiet and withdrawn. And this cycle continues, deepening your isolation until you're in a place where you have virtually no positive social connections. No one who sees you, no one who values you, no one who would notice if you disappeared entirely. At this point, the psychological shift becomes dangerous. Because when you have no positive connections to an environment, when you feel fundamentally rejected and devalued by a community, that community stops feeling like something you're part of. It starts feeling like something you're opposed to, something that hurt you, something that deserves consequences. This is where revenge fantasies often begin, and these fantasies serve a psychological function. They give the person a sense of power in a situation where they feel powerless. They provide an emotional release valve for rage and hurt that has nowhere else to go. And most importantly, they offer a narrative where the person isn't a victim anymore. They're an agent. They're someone who acts rather than someone who gets acted upon. For most people, these revenge fantasies stay fantasies. They're a way of coping with difficult emotions, not a blueprint for action. But for some people, especially those who are deeply isolated and don't have other emotional outlets or support systems, these fantasies can start to crystallize into actual plans. And here's what's crucial to understand. The planning phase often involves a reduction in warning signs, not an increase. The person becomes calmer. They might seem less distressed. They might even seem more stable. And this is because they've moved from the emotional turmoil of feeling helpless to the psychological structure of having a plan. Even if that plan is horrific, even if it's going to ruin their life and hurt others, the simple fact of having decided on a course of action provides psychological relief. This is likely what was happening with Luke. He had been dealing with sustained bullying and social rejection. He had reached out in subtle ways, like accepting that car ride and opening up about his struggles. But the systematic problems continued. No one intervened with the seniors who were harassing him. No one created a support system. And eventually, he made a plan. He got a weapon. He got a mask. He prepared to do something terrible. But then something happened that's actually incredibly psychologically significant. He didn't go through with it. He tried to enter the school, was blocked by security, and instead of escalating, instead of finding another way in, instead of waiting for an opportunity, he left. And then he did something that almost no one does in these situations. He sought out the one person who had shown him kindness and tried to explain himself. This is where the psychology becomes complex. On one hand, Luke had clearly reached a point where he was willing to potentially commit violence. He had crossed psychological barriers that most people never cross. But on the other hand, some part of him was still reaching out for connection, still hoping that someone would understand, still looking for a reason not to go through with it. And this is something that gets lost in most discussions of school violence. We tend to see perpetrators as either completely evil or completely misunderstood, but the reality is usually more complicated. Many people who commit or attempt to commit school violence are genuinely struggling with mental health issues, genuine trauma, genuine social isolation. And simultaneously, they're making choices that are wrong, harmful, and unjustifiable. Both things can be true at once. Luke was a victim of bullying and systemic failure, and Luke also chose to bring a weapon to school with what was presumably the intent to use it. We can understand how he got to that point while also being absolutely clear that his actions were wrong and dangerous. What's important from a prevention standpoint is recognizing that the path to violence is usually long, visible, and potentially interruptible. If the teacher had stopped the bullying in computer class, if the school had effective mental health support, if other students had befriended Luke or stood up for him, if the one student who showed him kindness had been able to connect him with help instead of just dropping him off at home, any of these interventions might have changed the outcome. Section 5. The clown phenomenon and copycat behavior. Let's talk about something that happened in 2016 and terrified an entire generation of kids. The killer clown sightings. This phenomenon is actually a perfect example of how fear spreads. how copycat behavior works, and how social media can amplify threats, both real and imagined. For those who don't remember or weren't aware, in 2016 there was a wave of reports across the United States and other countries of people dressed as clowns appearing in public spaces, often near schools, sometimes acting threateningly. These sightings caused widespread panic, led to numerous school lockdowns, and even resulted in arrests. But here's the interesting part from a psychological perspective. Many of these sightings were never confirmed. Many were hoaxes or pranks. Some were cases of mass hysteria where people thought they saw clowns when they hadn't, but some were real. And that ambiguity, that mix of real threats and imagined ones, created a perfect storm of fear. Because when you don't know which reports are real, you have to treat all of them as potentially real. And when you're a child, especially an elementary school child, the idea of a scary clown showing up at your school taps into deep-seated fears that are hard to rationalize away. The story of the clown appearing outside a fifth-grade classroom window is particularly interesting because it demonstrates several psychological principles. First, there's the initial ambiguity. When the student first said, "There's a clown outside," some kids thought it was funny. They laughed, because a clown outside a school window is absurd. It doesn't fit into the normal schema of how the world works. So the brain's first response is to treat it as a joke or a game. But then the clown didn't leave. He kept standing there, smiling, waving, staring directly at the classroom. And this is where the psychological impact shifts, because now the ambiguity is resolved in a threatening direction. This isn't a joke. This isn't a coincidence. This is someone who is deliberately positioning themselves to be seen by children and deliberately acting in a way that's unsettling. The teacher's response is important to note. She tried verbal intervention first, telling the person to leave because classes were in session. This is a normal adult response to an abnormal situation. She attempted to establish normalcy and authority. But when that didn't work, when the person didn't respond or comply, she escalated appropriately. She called the office, closed the blinds, and eventually the school went into lockdown. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The clown didn't just leave after the lockdown. He came back. He positioned himself near the woods behind the school, partially hidden, and waited for students to be dismissed. He watched children walking home. He waved at specific girls, trying to call them over. This suggests that the intent wasn't just to scare people for fun. The intent might have been something much darker. This is where we need to talk about copycat behavior and how certain types of threats spread through social systems. The clown phenomenon of 2016 started with a few isolated incidents, possibly marketing stunts for a movie or random pranks. But then those incidents were reported on social media and news outlets. And when other people saw those reports, some of them thought, "I could do that." And they did. They dressed up as clowns, appeared in public spaces, scared people, and documented the reactions. This created a feedback loop. More incidents led to more coverage, which led to more copycats, which led to more coverage. And within this feedback loop, the nature of the incident started to escalate. What began as relatively harmless pranks evolved into more threatening behavior. People started carrying weapons while dressed as clowns. People started approaching children. People started making explicit threats. From a psychological perspective, this escalation happens because each copycat is competing for attention and impact. If the last clown sighting just involved someone standing on a street corner, the next person who wants attention has to do something more extreme to stand out. So they get closer to schools. They interact with children. They wave them over. They follow them. And this is where the real danger emerges. Because at some point in this escalation, someone with genuinely bad intentions can hide within the pattern of pranksters. The community is already on edge. There have already been multiple clown sightings. So when someone shows up dressed as a clown near a school, everyone assumes it's another prank, another copycat, another attention seeker. But what if it's not? What if it's someone using the phenomenon as cover for something worse? This is exactly what seemed to be happening in the story. The clown appeared at the school twice. First outside a classroom window during school hours, which triggered a lockdown, and then again behind the school near the woods, specifically targeting young girls who were walking home. That's not prank behavior. That's predatory behavior using the clown disguised as a method to approach children without immediately triggering adult intervention. And this gets to a critical point about how we assess threats in schools. Not every concerning incident is equivalent. Some things are pranks. Some things are cries for help. Some things are genuine threats. And distinguishing between these categories requires both understanding the context and taking all incidents seriously enough to investigate properly. Section 6. When danger comes from outside. Most of the time when we think about school violence, we think about threats that come from inside the school community. Students, staff, or former students who have some connection to the school. But there's another category of threat that's equally dangerous and often less predictable. Threats that come from completely outside the school system. The story about the escaped prisoner trying to collect his biological daughter is a perfect example of this. Here was someone who had no legitimate connection to the school, no right to be there, no legal claim to the child he was trying to take. And yet he still managed to create a situation that put an entire school on lockdown for nearly an hour. This type of threat is particularly challenging for schools because traditional security measures are designed primarily to keep out random intruders or respond to internal threats. But when someone has specific knowledge about a student, when they know exactly which school to target and exactly who they're looking for, they can be much more difficult to stop. The psychological impact of this type of threat is also distinct. For the student being targeted, this wasn't about random school violence. This was personal. This was someone from her past, specifically her biological father who had murdered her mother, trying to access her. The trauma of that situation is layered in ways that most school violence isn't. It's not just about being scared during a lockdown. It's about the violation of knowing that someone who should never be in your life managed to get close enough to your school that a lockdown was necessary. For the teacher in this situation, who had taken in this child after her mother's murder, the psychological burden is immense. She was at school, in her professional role, and suddenly had to protect her stepdaughter from a very specific, very personal threat. And she had to do it while also managing a classroom full of other students who were in lockdown without understanding why. This brings up an important point about how schools communicate during threat situations. In this case, the teacher knew what the lockdown was about because she had been the one to trigger it. But the other teachers and students didn't know. They were in lockdown without understanding the nature of the threat, which creates its own form of psychological distress. The uncertainty, the not knowing, can sometimes be worse than knowing there's a specific danger. On the other hand, there are good reasons not to provide detailed information during an active threat situation. If everyone in the school knew that an escaped murderer was trying to access a specific student, that information could spread in ways that put the targeted student at risk. Other students might panic. People might try to take matters into their own hands. The information could leak to the person creating the threat through students contacting people outside the school. So there's a delicate balance between providing enough information for people to take appropriate precautions and withholding information to prevent further complications. And schools often err on the side of providing minimal information, which makes sense from a security standpoint, but creates psychological challenges for everyone experiencing the lockdown. Another aspect of external threats that's worth discussing is how they intersect with correctional system failures. In this case, 20 prisoners escaped during a transport accident. 20. That's not just a small security breach. That's a massive systematic failure. And schools became secondary victims of that failure because they had to deal with the consequences of escaped prisoners potentially targeting students. This raises questions about how different institutional systems communicate and coordinate. When prisoners escape, especially violent offenders, how quickly are schools notified? How do schools know which students might be at risk? What protocols exist for rapidly increasing security when external threats are identified? In this case, police were already at the house waiting for the prisoner, and they were able to respond quickly to the school when the lockdown occurred. But that's reactive, not proactive. A more effective system would involve immediate notification to schools when prisoners with connections to students escape or are released. Schools should have access to information about which students have family members who might pose a threat, and there should be clear protocols for rapidly implementing additional security measures when external threats are identified. Conclusion: surviving and healing. We've covered a lot of difficult material in this video. Stories of lockdowns, analyses of warning signs, discussions of systematic failures, examinations of perpetrator psychology. And if you've made it this far, you're probably feeling a mix of emotions. Maybe fear about the reality of school violence. Maybe anger about the systematic failures that allow these situations to develop. Maybe sadness for the people involved in these stories, both the victims and even some of the perpetrators who were failed by the systems that should have protected them. All of those feelings are valid. School violence is a complex, difficult problem that doesn't have simple solutions. But I want to end on something more hopeful, because the truth is, most schools never experience serious violence. Most students will never be in a real lockdown situation. And when lockdowns do occur, most of them end without anyone being physically harmed. But the psychological impact remains, and that's what we need to address. If you've experienced a school lockdown, even if nothing physically happened to you, that experience has changed how you perceive safety. It's changed how you feel in schools, and it's important to acknowledge that trauma and seek support for it. Talk to someone, whether that's a parent, a counselor, a therapist, or a trusted friend. Don't minimize your experience by telling yourself that nothing really happened or that other people had it worse. Your trauma is valid, your fear is real, and you deserve support in processing it. For parents and teachers watching this, understand that students need help interpreting and processing these experiences. Don't avoid talking about lockdowns. Don't dismiss their fears. Create space for them to express their feelings and validate those feelings even if they seem disproportionate to you. And for schools, please, invest in prevention as much as you invest in response. Physical security is important, but psychological support, anti-bullying programs, inclusive culture building, and early intervention for at-risk students are just as crucial. Every student who feels connected, seen, and valued in their school community is a student who's less likely to become either a perpetrator or a victim of violence. School should be a place of learning, growth, and community, not a place where students have to hide in closets in the dark. Wondering if they're safe. We can do better. We must do better. And it starts with understanding the psychology behind these situations and having the courage to address them honestly. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, take care of each other, and remember that kindness can literally save lives.